All right, this is Science and Law Video Lecture 8.5. Hopefully you just watched the Colbert Report clip on sampling and polling. So I want to talk in this video lecture about surveys and sampling. So we would say survey studies are using correlational research designs. We used to cover in this class consumer confusion survey research in trademark or service mark lawsuits. We probably won't cover that this semester. But of course, the other major example that we see all around us are polls of any kind, including political polls. So the key issue in surveys and polls is sampling, right? I mean, the only national survey where there isn't sampling is the census, where everyone in the country is supposed to be included. But the rest of the time, there's some population you're interested in, but because of time and limitations of resources, you don't study the entire population, you just study a subset of that population or a sample. Sampling is used not only with correlational research design like surveys and pollings, but certainly we use sampling also in experiments, and we're also going to talk about that. Here we have an example of a Gallup poll, an example of a correlational design, kind of a depressing commentary on the state of science education in the United States. Sort of a really interesting one for this class. So if you want to take a look at it, you should pause the video here and take a depressing look at this. All right, so the first important thing to note about sampling is that for sampling purposes, the size of a sample is important to a point, but it is not the crucial issue. What is the crucial issue? The representativeness of the sample. So if we have a political poll that's predicting election results, it's usually very accurate, despite the fact that they're using only a few thousand people to predict the voting behavior of tens of millions of people. They are usually accurate because the pollsters go to great lengths to be sure the samples are representative of the voting population, right? Representative of age, race, gender, region of the country or state, what their likelihood of voting is, and so on. And under very carefully controlled conditions, a very small but representative sample is going to give you an accurate ballpark estimate. So basically, in research design, the science of research isn't necessarily improved by having a sample that is quite a bit larger, right? In fact, as you saw in the reading, samples of just 30 or more are usually considered large samples, and when they are representative of the population, well randomized, right, they're going to be generalizable as a general matter to the population. So you saw in Statistics Without Tears that if you have a good randomized sample of 30 or more, you can assume that you can use that sample mean and standard deviation to calculate your standard error of the mean for the population. Or if you haven't read that portion of Statistics Without Tears yet, you will see that. So it's true, as a general matter, larger is better, because the larger your sample, the lower your chances are of there being a sampling error and not really having a representative sample. But over a certain size, any reduction in error for a larger sample gets smaller and smaller. So this always has to be weighed against the additional cost and time involved in using larger samples. And remember, these same rules about sampling are going to apply in the true experiment context as well. They're a small representative sample in a correlational research can garner you an accurate ballpark estimate, like in our Gallup poll. And in experimental research, a small sample that's well randomized into experimental groups can give you accurate generalizable experimental data. Now, when I say small here, of course, I'm assuming that you'd have at least 30. And on the other hand, a very large but faulty and unrepresentative sample in correlational research might give you an estimate that is mathematically very precise if you plug it into the formula, just due to the sheer huge size of the sample, but it might not reflect at all the correct measure of the population because it wasn't carefully constructed to be representative. And the same thing with true experiments. Large but unrepresentative experimental samples, again, might give you data that appear to be statistically significant just due to the fact that it's easier to have a statistically significant result with larger samples. But because of the flaws in the way you chose your original sample to then be randomized into your experimental groups, your data are probably wrong. And always remember, time and money are always a concern with any kind of polling or survey or research. So you want to very carefully construct your method of sampling so that you can use the smallest sample size that will still be accurately representative of the population you're interested in, or give you well randomized experimental groups in the experimental context. So the definitions of population and sample, very obvious. A population is just a group with some kind of common construct that you have selected to try to study. And a sample, of course, is just a small proportion of that population that you're choosing to observe or analyze. You'll see on this slide the letters and Greek symbols sometimes used to represent some of the statistical values that we're going to be learning about. So we have mu on here, the Greek symbol for population mean. That's down here. Sigma, the symbol for standard deviation of the population. So there are a lot of different sampling methods. Probability sampling, which is mainly what you want to look for in scientific research or polling or survey research, has to be distinguished from convenience sampling, right? Convenience sampling is just whoever you happen to run into, like those ridiculous people on the street interviews that local news shows like so much. Convenience sampling just utilizes whatever participants are available instead of using a random selection process. So it's obvious a convenience sample might not, and almost certainly probably doesn't, reflect your population. So you're not going to get any validly generalizable conclusions with a convenience sample. There are different types of random probability sampling depending upon what source you look at. I just want to talk about three main ones. The first one is simple random sampling. And with simple random sampling, every person in your population basically has the same probability of being in the sample. So in simple random sampling, you can't choose any member of your sample consciously. So great example here, just think of drawing names out of a hat or lotto balls out of the big lottery tumbler. Now, systematic sampling is a different story. You might want to use that when a population can be accurately listed. And then you use some sort of systematic procedure to choose your random sample. So for example, back in the day when we used to have phone books, you know, you might have used a phone book to administer a poll, and every 1,000th name in the phone book is chosen until you get a sample of 200. Certainly phone book method not used these days with so many cell phones, so we can't assume nowadays, if there even are phone books, that they actually contain any kind of representative population. The picture on the slide here shows systematic sampling with the population just lined up, taking every third person. So this is the kind of thing that used to be done in the early days of airport screening, for example, to choose people for that extra screening. Maybe something like this is still used, but they're also using specific profiling now as well, even though we don't have access to those methods. Another one that might be familiar to you is when law enforcement sets up a sobriety checkpoint, they're also supposed to systematically stop vehicles, like say choose every fifth car in order for it to comport with the Constitution. Okay, and the last kind of probability sampling I want to talk about is stratified random sampling. So what you do here is you first break your population up into groups of interest based on whatever shared attributes or characteristics. So maybe you'd break your population up by gender or age or ethnicity or region, and then you randomly sample from each group. So this is especially good if you have a particular stratum in your population that might end up being over or underrepresented in your sample. And you want to make sure that you get the proper percentage of those smaller strata in your final sample. So what you do is you divide it up into each stratum and then take a random sample from each in a number proportional to the stratum's size when you compare it to the population. And then you pool all of your subsets to form your overall random sample. Okay, and the last kind of sampling I just want to mention is purposeful sampling. A purposeful sample is going to be a non-representative subset of some larger population, but it's constructed to serve a very specific need or purpose. So you see this commonly with social science qualitative research, say, for example, ethnographic research in sociology or anthropology. So you might really call this just a much more sophisticated and better thought out convenience sample. So a good example is, let's say you're a researcher and you might have a specific group in mind that you want to look at, like, for example, high-level business executives. Certainly it might not be possible to even specify your population. You might not know the names of everybody in your population, and getting access to members of that population is going to be difficult. So a researcher in that instance might attempt to just zero in on your target group and then interview whoever is available. So the goal in research that might use this kind of purposeful sample isn't to randomize, but to produce an information-rich source. The research results might not be therefore generalizable per se, but still might be important for transfer, right? The applicability and giving meaning to other research in other contexts. All right, this is the end of video lecture 8.5.